Okay, so where we left off earlier was talking about government corporations and how, Amtrak in the U.S. Postal Service is a really good example of a government corporation. They typically charge for their services. It's not funded through taxpayer dollars. And they provide a service that could be delivered by the private sector. Now, the question then is, well, why is the government involved in a business sector that could be provided by UPS or FedEx or a private train company? And with the Postal Service and Amtrak especially, what we're looking at is um, kind of the flaw in capitalism, quite honestly, right? Like what the government has found is that if you live in rural Alaska or rural Colorado, honestly, for that matter, and you want to order something offline or somebody wants to send you something, um, if UPS is going to deliver it, for that to be profitable for them to function as a business, to get you a package, um, it is going to be, it's going to charge you $20 for a letter or $50 for a package. Or if, how many communities in America, like Pueblo, are really dependent on rail service for financial viability, right? Like the rail line that goes through Pueblo actually it supports something like $50 million annually in the local Pueblo economy. And so what the government realized is, we believe that people should be able to live anywhere in the 50 states that they want to. This is the United States. If you want to live in rural Alaska, rural Colorado, it doesn't matter. And you should be able to get access to services that everybody else has. And if the government got out of the postal service business, um, those people, except living in urban or suburban areas, would not have access to mail or trains or lots of other things, quite honestly. And so the government comes in and says, look, we understand that this is a little bit of a money making loss, but we are not bound by needing to provide dividends to shareholders. We simply have to deliver the service that we're charged with, which is getting mail. And so that's where government corporations come into. Um, Now, the fourth type of the bureaucratic agency that we're going to look at is the independent executive agency. Um, Basically, everything that doesn't fall into a regulatory commission, a government corporation, or a cabinet level position is considered an independent executive agency. The most famous kind are NASA, right? It's not a government corporation, at least not yet. It's certainly not a regulatory commission. It's not a cabinet level position. It is an independent executive agency. They're the head of NASA and the head of the General Services Administration or any of the other independent executives are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. All right, so now what role do bureaucracies have in the policymaking process, right? We know the role that the president has in the policymaking process. They can sign into law, they can veto, they can use the bully pulpit, they can do lots of things to push policy through. We know the role Congress has. That's pretty obvious, right? Or the super obvious policymaker in the federal government. We can even kind of make guesses before we even get to this unit about what the role that the courts have in the policymaking process, right? When you say something is unconstitutional or validated as constitutional, you are shaping, government policy. So, what role do bureaucracies have? Um, First off, we know that when it comes to policy, it is Congress or a president that issues policy goals, right? Lower air pollution, reduce highway deaths, improve, um, lower infant or women and infant mortality rates, improve literacy rates, improve access to internet for rural communities. These are all stated policy goals that are oftentimes enshrined into law by Congress or pushed by the presidency, and then they are given to the bureaucracy associated with that task to implement. And implementation is a hugely important word when we talk about bureaucracies. Implementation is where you take the task and you actually find the way to get it done. This policy implementation stage comes after laws are passed. So, once something gets on the policy agenda and, once it goes through the policy making process and then it's made as a law, then it's given to the bureaucracy to implement. Um, Implementation is basically can be accomplished in a lot of different ways, right? It can be accomplished, let's say, if it's a brand new law like regulating Bitcoin, right? As Bitcoin continues to rise in importance, at some point it's either, does Treasury do that, or does Congress basically say, you know what, this has become such a huge part of the global economy that we need to actually create a new agency who specializes and is staffed by people who really understand the Bitcoin economy. And so let's maybe create this new bureaucratic agency. Or they say, you know what, we don't need a new agency, but we are going to create a division in the Treasury Department or a division in the Securities and Exchange Commission, Independent Regulatory Commission. And we're going to basically say you are now tasked with regulating Bitcoin. And then, from that point on, whatever Congress or the president basically says as the goal, they give to the SEC or they give to the Treasury or they give to the new bureaucratic agency to basically translate the goals that are said to them into rules and guidelines, right? Standard operating procedures. Okay, we're saying make sure American citizens do not get screwed by Bitcoin. We're saying make sure that Bitcoin is fair and well regulated. Okay. Now we give that to the agency filled with experts who then say, okay, well, if we're going to accomplish this goal, we need to do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and maybe H. Um, and the agency is using the budget that it is provided and the personnel that it is, provided um, by the shoot, what is the bureaucratic agency that staffs all the Federal Services Administration? Um, uh, Basically, they're using the resources and personnel to accomplish the goals. So the question then we're going to kind of focus on, perhaps to close out today's lecture, although I guess we'll see, we still have some time, is why do well-intentioned policy plans fail when it comes time to implementation? And this is going to you're going to see a really good example of this in tomorrow's Do Now. But let's take a look at all the reasons why, really well-intentioned goals, good goals, end up going haywire when it comes time to the bureaucracy actually implementing them. The first problem that we see is in the design of the program. Um, let's take, for example, a really famous one where, Congress basically realized about 20 years ago that there was a major problem with health insurance. Because health insurance was bound by people's jobs so often, that people were getting stuck in jobs because they were worried of losing their health insurance, or people with layoffs as factories closed in Michigan and Ohio and all that. As factories closed, people were suddenly, through no fault of their own, lacking healthcare coverage. So that concern got on the policy agenda as the globalized economy was closing down manufacturing in America. And Congress says, okay, well, there's enough people paying attention to this. We need to fix this. So they designed this program called COBRA. I don't know exactly what the acronym COBRA stands for, but it essentially allows people who have lost their jobs for whatever reason to temporarily buy in to a small government run healthcare or health insurance thing that can kind of hold them over until they get a new job. And the big reason here is prior to Obamacare, if you had a period in your life where you went uninsured, let's say you had insurance for 20 years and then you lost your job and for 6 months you were uninsured, and then you get a new job, but a year after you get a new job you develop a heart condition. Well, what was happening was, health insurance companies were saying, that's not our fault. This health or this heart condition developed during that 6 months they were uninsured. So we're not going to cover this because it's a pre-existing condition, and we're not going to cover it. And so COBRA was designed for people lost their jobs that they could keep health insurance to prevent a gap in coverage and to mandate that there was no pre-existing conditions that health companies or health insurance companies were refusing. Okay, it's a good goal. It's a well-intentioned policy piece. The problem with it is once they created COBRA, they said, okay, go do this, and the bureaucratic agency tasked with doing it says, okay, we got this, and they put it in action. And what they found was when they applied market conditions without funding, that people would lose their jobs, and they'd say, well, you want to buy Cobra? And the person would say, well, maybe, let me see the costs. And they'd look at the costs and they'd say, well, you're telling me that to buy into Cobra it's $1,600 per month? Well, I just lost my job, I can't afford that. And so this well-intentioned policy plan fails because there wasn't funding attached, and they didn't anticipate the enormous cost that it would be for someone to buy into a small government-run health insurance. So that's poor program design, right? Even as it had a positive goal. The next reason that we're going to look at for why bureaucratic policy plans fail in the implementation stage is because of lack of clarity, right? Lack of clarity can sometimes even be purposeful, right? We sometimes see Congress and presidents give kind of vague or muddy policy goals to a bureaucratic agency, and they say, you figure it out. And the political reason for this, and maybe I'll give you a small chance to kind of think about this, why would Congress want to be purposely vague sometimes in kind of spelling out exactly how they want the bureaucracy to accomplish a policy goal? Do, 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 do. Well, the reason is because if the bureaucratic agency implements that policy goal and decides the rules and makes kind of the standard operating procedures, and then it goes bad or it fails, then Congress can simply say, well, we didn't do that, right? Like, we just told them to do it. It's not our fault that they they screwed up and that they didn't anticipate this thing. And we had all the greatest intentions in the world. It was the EPA who screwed it up. And so it buys them a little of what we call plausible deniability. We oftentimes also see that Congress or the presidency will assign contradictory goals. They'll say something like, we're going to create the National Park Service to preserve American parklands for future generations, preserve the beauty, manage public land, and then we're going to create the National Forest Service on the side, whose job it is to log national forests, right? And so these National Forest Service and the National Park Service, both in the Interior Department, have goals. One is to preserve, and the other is to basically log or manage logging. And these contradictory goals and the lack of clarity of whose goal is reigns supreme? Is the Park Service one the priority versus the National Forest Service, or vice versa? The third reason we're looking at here is because of lack of resources, right? Sometimes, Congress will come up with a well-intentioned policy goal, but not have the available discretionary funds or budget to fully fund the goal. And, take, for example, the most famous unfunded mandate, which is the Americans for Disability Act, right? Which is like, we need to make this country accessible and inclusive to people with disabilities, right? People in wheelchairs, blind people, deaf people, people who have physical disabilities outside of that. And they say, great, let's do it. That seems right. But, we're not going to give states and counties and cities the money to build those wheelchair ramps and elevators and, to install Braille on all of the plaques. And so, sometimes Congress will say, we're going to do this thing, and then special interests will say, yeah, we'll let you say that, but we don't really want you to do this really well because we do this thing, and you would be competing with us, and we don't want that. And so politicians basically will oftentimes try and please constituents, do that constituent service thing, and create a program that they really can't fund, like the Food and Drug Administration. They want to, give people confidence that their drugs are good, but we're not really going to fund it.